Tēnā koto katoa, and a very warm welcome to everyone to this special event, What Really Grinds My Alley Gears. This is to celebrate Global Accessibility Awareness Day and Techweek 22. My name is Zoe Horton. I'm an accessibility consultant for Intopia, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to introduce some really useful rants this evening. So the intention behind this event is not only to share some common frustrations experienced amongst practitioners and people with disabilities in the accessibility space, but to learn about the impacts that these have on people, and most importantly, to hear of any potential solutions. So this is a very solution-focused event, so hopefully it will end on a high and we'll have some solutions to take away. So before we make a start, I'd like to give some thanks, first of all, first to a11y and Intopia for actually sponsoring this event and providing the live captioning service as well. I'd also like to thank Chris Pycroft, Catherine Barcham, Laura Kerrison and Pranita Narayan for their hard work and assistance in getting this event off the ground and running smoothly. So now over to our wonderful panel of accessibility experts to introduce themselves and tell us what they do. So first of all, Sarah, could you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, my least favorite activity. I am one of the co-founders of Intopia, which is just my official hat, but my hat that I resonate with most is that I am an accessibility specialist and have been loving doing this for quite a few years. So I think, like many on the panel, I have quite a few rants saved up, but only space for one today.
Thanks, Sarah. And next, Gareth, please.
Oh, right. I was napping there. My name is Gareth Ford-Williams. Up to exactly pretty much a year ago, I was the head of accessibility and UX design at the BBC. So I'd been there 18 years, leading digital accessibility then. I left last year to follow a big question, which is around accessibility or inclusive design data, because we don't have any, particularly quant, and set up a company called a11y, a11y.com, with a gang of other ones, other people within the industry to actually try and bring data to our practice.
Thanks, Gareth. And Neil, over to you.
Kia ora, everybody. My name is Neil Jarvis. I based in Wellington, New Zealand, and I work with Intopia. I'm an accessibility consultant there. I've been with Intopia for a year, and prior to that have worked in the digital accessibility space for many years before then. And that's me.
Thanks, Neil. So now over to the rants. Let the ranting begin. So just how it's going to run down is each of our ranters are going to be asked to introduce themselves, tell us what they do, and then what really grinds their gears or their alley gears, how that's impacted them and any solutions that they've come up with themselves. And then we'll pass over to the panel if appropriate, extra solutions can be suggested. So first of all, I'm going to go in the order of what's on my screen. So Alexa, you're up first. So Alexa, could you please introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Kia ora koto katoa. I'm Alexa. I'm a product owner. So I do that for two different products. So I work at BNZ, and I also work and consult for an accessible form builder called Formally. And my pronouns are she, her. Shall I start ranting?
Yeah, what really grinds your alley gears, Alexa? Let it go.
Yes, so I'm a product person and I spend my days thinking about products. And so the thing that really grinds my ally gears is that if you are a person who is trying to look for things to help improve the accessibility of your product because you are a well-intentioned person and you do a Google or Bing search for that, what's going to come up is a lot of products whose sole focus is how are you meeting legislative or WCAG or 508 requirements. And the sole purpose of these, or the key purpose of these products, is actually to help companies avoid legal repercussions for providing disabling experiences, rather than to actually help people who are having disabling experiences have a more inclusive digital presence experience generally. And so that really grinds my gears, because I think that the focus of those products is wrong. I don't like that the focus is on how can we prevent big companies from losing money, rather than focus on how do we help promote education and empathy for other people's experiences. So that's something that I find aggravating and annoying when I'm on the internet.
Thank you for sharing that. And what impact do you think this is having, not only on you personally, but on organizations and the accessibility space itself?
Yeah, so I wrote some notes down, so I'm just going to make sure I cover the points I wanted to raise. So the key kind of impacts is, I think the first one is just around the framing of the problem, and that thinking about accessibility and creating inclusive and accessible experiences, and how that actually creates a more equitable digital space. And rather than using that framing, the framing is, how do I meet the bare legislative minimum so that I don't get in trouble, or so that my company doesn't get in trouble? And that takes the framing away from helping people and helping communities, and turns it into a conversation about lawsuits and money. And that's not the directive that I think helps people overall.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so the kind of flip side of that, as well as what I mentioned before about, like, for well-meaning people, for people who are actually just interested in trying to create more inclusive experiences, especially for companies who pay a lot of money for good copywriters that write lots of nice things about, oh, well, our product will help you if you use this. They think that they're doing the right thing, but they're actually probably investing their money in the wrong place. And then they've already spent more money than they expected to not get the outcomes that they wanted.
Okay, so definite big problem that you've highlighted there. And what solutions do you think there is to this problem?
Well, yeah, I was thinking about it a lot. So I think the thing that I kind of reflected on is that I think what I'm talking about is a symptom rather than the root cause. I think the root cause is generally more to do with a lack of overall knowledge and understanding. And so I think if people had more, I guess, I don't know if literacy is quite the right word for it, but more of like an overall view and perspective, then they might be able to navigate that content with a little bit more wisdom, maybe. But I think in the absence of that, having access to people who do know their ins and outs of that world and why accessibility is important, and who are open to having kororo about it, is, to me, like the number one solution to that is, how can you reach out to people and engage with people in the community and compensate them for their time to help you upskill and help the people around you upskill and bring people with you so that they understand. Because I think it's one of those like pay it forward type situations where once you know, help other people get to that point too. So that's my recommended solution to that is find help yourself and then help other people.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Alexa. And I don't know if any of our expert panel have anything additional to suggest to Alexa's solution there.
I'm happy to go. Oh, you've hit a trigger for me, which is good, I suppose. But exactly what you're talking about is what I always call legal experience design, is that people mix it up with user experience design. And it's not. It's designing for lawyers. When you're designing for compliance, you're designing for what your compliance officer wants to tick off and what your lawyers want to feel safe about. You're then forgetting that actually this is about people. And so you're never going to get things that are about people when you're purely focused on regulation. The two things don't go. It's always that kind of mix up. Is you don't, you know, you wouldn't go to lawyers. You shouldn't go to lawyers for design advice. And they're not very good at design. And in the same way as you don't go to designers for legal advice, it's you know, generally speaking, there may be some very, very, very good designers out there who really know the law, but generally speaking, I wouldn't go and do this. And yet we mix these two things up when it comes to accessibility, and you know, and everything gets driven around checklists and compliance, and that was all driven. All of that has come from just compliance only. If you actually want to make things accessible, there's some good stuff in there, yes, but it's not the answer. And you need to design experiences for people. And you're absolutely right. I mean, this is all about engaging with people up front, understanding the needs of your audience. You know, it's not necessarily even the demographics of a medical condition. You know, we all needs are transient, needs are based on impairment, and it's very social model is what you should be doing rather than medical model, which is compliance. I think there's a wonderful product designer called Dieter Rams from the 1970s, and he kind of, I think he mentored Jonathan Ives for Apple, and he said, not designing, I'm going to get this wrong, hang on a minute, I'm paraphrasing, sorry Dieter, not designing, what was it? No, the one and only cardinal sin in design is not designing for the reality in which we live. And you know, people's impairment, whether it's permanent or situational, transient, whatever, and the way the barriers that are created when we don't design for them are the reality in which we live. So this all should be sitting firmly within design. I think I've gone off on a massive tangent there.
Thank you so much for that, Gareth. I'm sure a lot of that is very useful for our attendees as well. Thank you. Okay, our second rant. So Armando, you're next on my screen. So would you like to introduce yourself first of all? Tell us what you do.
Of course. Kia ora, everyone. I'm Armando. I'm an experienced design manager at Atlassian. I'm based in Auckland, New Zealand. And yeah, should I go?
Yeah, so Armando, what really grinds your alley gears?
Well, I think to answer that question, I need to share first why I care about accessibility. And I got into software design not because I wanted to make things pretty, and don't judge me on that one, but because I wanted to make things useful, but useful for everyone. And I started my career working as an intern in a small web design shop in Chile, where I am from, where the two founders were obsessed with semantic HTML and accessibility. So I think I got a little spoiled. And then I started my own UX agency with my best friend, who was an engineer that's obsessed with accessibility. So as we were designing and building the experiences for our customers, we had full control of how accessible they were. So accessibility was front and center. So I became even more accessibility spoiled. But then a couple of years later, I joined a super successful hyper-growth startup. And guess what? Accessibility was not even on the nice to have list. And they were okay with that. And that's when I actually learned about accessibility. And I realized that even though I knew the technical side of it, and I knew why it was important, there was a lot of people who didn't understand the value of it. So understanding how to promote, evangelize, and influence accessibility in an organization was the real enabler of creating truly accessible products. So that's what really bothers me about accessibility, is when it's not regarded as part of the core value proposition of an organization's offering.
Thank you for that, rant, Armando. And how has this impacted you personally, or how do you think it impacts you know, people in general, or the accessibility space and organizations?
I'm gonna share a personal story on that one. And yeah, some years ago, I was working on a big redesign for an enterprise hospital management system. And one day I was at the office, and I got a call from a really upset product manager asking me if I could stay a little longer in the office. She needed to talk to me. And when we met, She told me that through one of our customer support partners, she learned that one of the hospitals where our system was deployed filed several complaints about the contrast ratio in our UI, especially low lighting settings. And those complaints were interpreted as feature requests by the customer support team, and they kept piling up in a roadmap without being prioritized. So that day, when she talked to me, the PM was informed that the hospital filed a formal complaint against our software, considering a health hazard, as it was causing headaches to their staff members. I'm talking about headaches, like literally headaches. We usually talk about our designs potentially being a headache, but in this case was literal. So I spent 3 full days working with another designer and a couple of developers, redoing all the CSS to prepare a fix that was deployed later that week. So in terms of the impact of accessibility, that was a real kind of like a wake-up call.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And solutions, did you find, any solutions to this issue yourself that you would suggest?
Yeah. So I think there are many approaches to advocate and get buy-in for accessibility in an organization. But I will start with what hasn't worked for me, which is talking about accessibility. And it's really sad. But as soon as you talk about making something accessible, teams consider that as something extra or something you can do later, something that is not part of the core value proposition of the product. It's almost like a linguistic nuance. But if we reflect on the language we use and talk about making something more usable to reach a wider segment of users, like power users, people with impaired vision, or even people with crappy monitors, I feel teams are more open to it. And that would be a quick win, I think, just changing the language. And then for me, if there is something closer to a silver bullet for accessibility, is to have a design system that's accessible and it's widely adopted by the teams. And something else that I've tried with success is to actually bring customers with disabilities to the office and get them to talk to the team. Nothing can beat the experience of putting a face and a voice to that term accessibility that everyone is frowning upon.
Yeah, I think they're great solutions. Any of the panelists have anything to add to those solutions? I think they're pretty good suggestions, but Neil, Sarah,
happy
Gareth?
to go second. I'll go second. So
Okay.
Go on,
Neil?
Oh, you go.
all I was going to say, when you talk about, sort of changing language, and sometimes I feel like we actually need to be a little bit sneaky, and it's what I've heard. I can't say I have children, but getting your children to eat their vegetables, where sometimes you pop it in something else or that kind of thing to cover it up, and then people, that those kids, they don't realize they're eating their vegetables until it's too late. And I sometimes feel we can do the same with accessibility. It's really all about how we talk about it and sell it. But recently, I've been trying to move away from, and you mentioned it about, the different scenarios people find themselves in, but, it's just a user need. And so reframing it as that too, and I think it's about using that language and those concepts that the people you're talking to, and this is going to vary depending on whether you're talking to a UXer, which, for them, UX and user needs and that kind of thing sort of resonate. For engineers, sometimes you might press the quality, sort of button with engineers, and it can vary from person to person. And obviously then your execs, which I don't particularly like, so. But I think that point of, really finding, reframing that and then finding that thing to hook into that resonates with either the individual or the person's role or what they want that I would say is a perfect summary of what we can do in this scenario.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. Neil, did you have anything extra to add?
Well, only that I think it's probably the key for me is to change the jargon, because that's what puts people off a lot. They hear the word accessibility and either they react in the way that Armando described, and they think it's somebody else's job, as we've already heard, or they think, oh, accessibility, I know all about that, but they're thinking something completely different to what we're talking about. Accessibility is such a vague term, and it means so many things to so many people. So I think sometimes we need to be cognizant of the fact that not everyone has the same understanding of the term that we have, and that's all right. And so that thing that Sarah was just saying there about different roles have different responses and different needs, absolutely. So sit down with the people in comms and marketing, or the executives who are making the call as to what systems to invest in. Sit down with your product developers, with your designers and testers, and remind them in the nicest possible way why they're doing what they're doing, because they don't want to do a bad job. They want to do a good job that everybody can benefit from. They sometimes get lost in the weeds, and that's what I think we need to try and help with. So be a little bit more open to speaking their language rather than ours.
Thanks, Neil. Great extra suggestions.
Can I chuck in a couple of things on top? Is that just all right? So I really like what they've pulled up with around the word accessibility. It's such a loaded word, and there's so many different perspectives around it, and it can work to its own detriment as well as benefit at times. And I think they again, completely agree. It depends on the individual you're talking to, is whether they see it as worthy or worthwhile. And worthiness is kind of the enemy of what we're trying to do in a lot of cases, because it then, as soon as it's seen as worthy, it's seen as a nice to have, a thing that you do in the end. Wouldn't be pleasant if we, and then don't see it as core. And I think the case in point that Armando brought up around the impact of not considering color contrast, that's just dreadful user research. That wasn't an accessibility thing. Is no one did any user research to understand what was happening at the end, who was actually going to be using this software, in what situation and environment, and what the potential barriers were going to be. You needed a good design researcher who could have actually brought that in as a design requirement, because they understood accessibility in terms of situation and environment. So that's an outcome of just poor research. And it reminded me of the 2012 Olympics, when we were rebuilding the BBC Sport app, mobile application, and we were pulling in all of the accessibility. It was the first time we were doing the accessibility guidelines around mobile. And one of the things that we knew around color contrast, a core behavior of app users on sports apps, particularly when they're out in events, is that it's about battery life. And this is what good design research told us, was people turn the brightness of their screens down to preserve their battery life, therefore vision impairing themselves when using the app. So if we don't make it as high contrast as possible, people can't turn the screen brightness down, they run out of battery, they have a dreadful user experience. It's mainstream accessibility. And therefore good design research brought the accessibility into core UX within the context. And the last thing I would always say is there's just one thing to do. If you're in this kind of situation, you believe that things are going to not go well. We have our crystal ball, Ali, crystal ball sometimes with these things. And I go, you have the conversations with the team and go, we're not quite in a mature enough understanding to know that this is going to go comfortably. Is try this little trick out, is get the whole team together, product managers, developers, UXers, the lot, before we start designing and building anything. So we've just got an idea. Nice thing about an idea, everyone has equal access to an idea. There's no barriers to an idea. But before we start making any decisions, run a workshop called Who Are We Willing to Exclude? And actually get the entire team to write down a list of everyone that they're happy not to actively exclude, but if they can't use it, we're not bothered. You know, so if you were designing a news application, you're not going to be designing it for the under fives. So, you know, and that's fine. And if anyone under 5 can't use the news app, we're not bothered. We're not going to we're not going to design for them. And you end up creating a list. It might be to do with platform access, language, all sorts of different things. Everyone else gets a designed experience. And if they don't, someone has to turn around and say, no, we're de-scoping the support for that person. And they have to name themselves and add them to the other list. It pushes accessibility into every sprint and discussion.
That's a great suggestion.
It's quite neat. Yeah.
Love it.
Thanks, Gareth.
It's really awkward. It's wonderful. Nobody wants to go first.
Okay. So that's our second rant. These are really great things to share. Thank you so much. And next on my screen, our third ranter is Nico. So Nico, could you introduce yourself? Tell us what you do.
Hi, I'm Nico. What I do is an interesting question because I probably am doing a lot of things at the moment. At the moment, I'm pursuing my post degree in behavioral science. Ergo, I'm doing another things on the side to actually still generating some
side hustles.
Exactly. So yeah, I am in parallel. I'm co-founder of a small studio, boutique studio, if you want, of user experience, mainly focusing research and strategy, and essentially trying to cherry pick the type of project that are aligned with my principles or values. And at the same time, I'm recently joined, or I'm contracting for Clairpoint at the moment in a project for I don't think I can mention the clients at this stage.
Okay.
But yeah, in the past, I've been working in New Zealand industry for a while as a internal capability in large financial organizations, a bank, a yellow one. I was the manager of a very large 40 designers team in a telco, a purple one, and I've been in agencies as well as a researcher, strategist. Surprisingly, Armando, I'm from Chile as well. That's really odd to find Chileans around it. And so yeah, when you ask me who I am or what I do, and actually at the moment I'm doing a lot of stuff. Hard to answer that question.
Sounds like a busy guy. So yeah. Nico, what really grinds your alley gears?
A lot of things, right? But
just one.
I guess remembering being part of internal capability in large organizations is not necessarily when things are being created where you need most of the support. It's more in the space of remediating what has all been already created, ingrained in very old infrastructure, software architecture, or software platforms that nobody wants to touch. And usually, sorry, my daughter is going to bed. And yeah, it's that kind of things that we have engaged with wonderful partners. For example, with Zoe, when you came to do assessment for us in that yellow bank, and we ended up with a massive list, which is necessarily acknowledged as a accessibility debt, I like to call it. And then how you deal with accessibility debt when everything is agile, everything is the creation of a new team to create something new, deliver it and forget about it. Who actually is going to look after what it's there, and we keep building things on top of that. And that was a common problem, common challenge in the telco that I was dealing with. So in the first instance, I was in the trench, right, trying to actually help and move around, and in the second instance, I was more in the influential spectrum. But then there's always the problem of the budget and who owns and the governance and how you deal or navigate the internal politics, because the key is to acknowledge that you won't be able to solve this problem from one day to another, right? And the key is to acknowledge that talking about inclusiveness, talking about awareness of use case and scenarios, when you actually want to remediate something that has been created decades ago, it's arguably speaking the right thing to do, but arguably speaking the hardest way to get something done. So yeah, that's pretty much the key challenge, one of the biggest rants that I have about it.
Yeah, so the accessibility tech debt that's caused, that's a common frustration. Thanks for sharing that. And how did that impact on you personally in your role and the organization itself?
Well,
or generally?
Yeah, in general, it means that I ended up focusing my efforts on if you want, corporate strategy and how to navigate a tactical approach to actually get those things sorted, and putting me extremely away from my craft, which is one of the things that I love the most.
Yeah. And sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, what solution did you come to yourself? Do you think that there is a solution to this problem that you could share?
Yeah, in both cases, the solution was very similar. And again, this is a matter of understanding the corporate tactics. For example, it is very common that towards the end of financial year, you will have specific teams or departments that have budget to burn. If they don't burn that budget, they don't get that money for the next year. So a lot of things happen. The first one is having an assessment of what's the current situation is a starting point, right? And with that assessment, the next step is try to categorize that assessment in terms of the impact of the remediation, or the current impact for our current users, and the criticality of the task itself, right? So you combine both things, put a nice, beautiful diagram with quadrants, and you ended up saying, this is high impact with for a high critical task, and then you can actually position or prioritize those tasks from the user impact point of view. However, there's a third axis that is never considered there, which is, what is the cost for the remediation? So there's where you start actually putting the radar and figuring out where you are in the current stage of financial year, where you are in all of those elements. So the example I was giving about the end of financial year where people have budget, well, that's one tactic you take. So you identify out of all of these tasks that are in your high priority, what are the squads that owns them? And then you figure out which one of these squads actually have budget to burn. And only then you actually start trying to do something about it. Otherwise, you try to go too wide and nothing gets done. And then, of course, a follow-up of that one, it's usually when you start the next financial year, they will start making a lot of noise about the great things they have been doing about remediation of accessibility debt. And then more people that actually are covered by the same task. Because the key thing is, when a squad that owns a specific task go back and remediate something that is ingrained in platform, is solving the same problem for many other squads that are actually using the same platform. So you ended up having a wider group of people jumping on the bandwagon and actually communicating how wonderful they are because they have solved that problem. And you start actually creating a snowball. So that's probably a nice story that ended up in that situation.
Thank you, Nico. Thanks so much for sharing that. I'm not sure if any of the panel have an additional solution, or you think he's covered that quite well. Gareth?
Yeah, give me anything. I'll tell you a little bit about something. There's some really good stuff in there, and there are loads of different ways that you can tackle this depending on the organization. Exactly, finding unspent budget is an art form, and you need to do it if you're working in accessibility. There's always someone that says, I've got a bunch of cash, I need to get rid of it, or I don't get it again next year. And you have always have a backlog of things, of ways you can spend that budget. And it's just like, I magically have a statement of work here for you, and push it through really quickly. And you take those opportunities. I think there's also, there's other things around convergence within planning, within organizations. And you have to be an opportunist. I mean, BBC is very good where it is now, but it took us 18 years to get there. And there was a lot of opportunity. I knew when things were being rebuilt. I knew when things were being sunsetted. I knew when things were happening, because I got in there early and just turned around and said, right, we're rebuilding that thing that's been irritating me for 3 years is finally going, and I'm going to get in there fast, and I'm going to make sure that the thing that replaces it fixes it. And so you always have this broad picture. There's other things that you can do as well. It's so there was a thing, I'm not going to take credit for this. There's a wonderful accessibility lead called Catherine Green. She's still in BBC World Service, and she brought in a thing called accessibility swarms into the BBC. I don't know if she even created it as an idea or adapted it from other types of swarms. So instead of running training sessions where you would all be sat in a classroom and classroom training, what we do is run training sessions in a product and say, right, we're going to have a training day around accessibility. You can usually find the budget, you bring in some specialists, and what you do is create mixed discipline teams, and you fix the backlog as the training exercise. Each team gets given a different ticket, and you all start clearing the tickets during the day and seeing which teams can clear the most amount of tickets. And they have people walking around who are specialists in different areas and users, all giving them advice. And so not only are you building skills, you're also shifting your backlog. I'm going to put, there's a link there to the actual resource on the BBC News site, which tells you how to do this. It's a really nice, efficient way of dealing with it and using existing training budget. And I think the other thing as well, I'd recommend to make sure that it's a long-term fix is then I'm a massive fan of documentation-driven development. You know, so many times we write the code, design the code, and then document it afterwards. I always say the documentation comes before a single line of code is written. And you should always, when you learn things about this, capture it against the design pattern and write a document that tells everyone how the code should behave, not what the code is. I don't care what framework it works, how you build it. That's the developer's decision, but how it behaves and how it tests is the accessibility side of it. And so then you start building up a load of resource. So when anyone builds a button, you say, there's the button document over there. It tells you exactly how your button should behave, no matter how you build it. Users don't care what things are built in, they care how they behave. And so you can then have different teams building things in different frameworks, yet all the button experiences remain consistent. It also stops people having to go to WCAG continuously. That's kind of like the naughty step. You know, no one wants to go to WCAG because no one understands it. It's massive, it's unusable. It's 2 days later and you're in tears because you don't know what's relevant to you. Whereas if you have a button document, you can build a button and get it out there and it's completely WCAG compliant within an hour. You know, so different things. I'll pop up a couple of resources around that as well.
Thank you,
just sort of examples.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm just conscious of the time. So we're going to go on to our fourth rant, but I should have mentioned this at the beginning. There is a Q&A panel at the bottom for all of our attendees to put in your own rants, frustrations in the accessibility space that you would like to hear solutions for, or if you just want to rant and get it off your chest, just feel free, but preferably in the Q&A panel rather than the chat. Okay, so on to our rant number 4. So we have Thomas Bryan next. Could you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Yeah, sure. Kia ora, everyone. I'm Thomas Bryan and I'm a blind person and live in Wellington. And so when I access technology, I'm using a screen reader, be it on a computer or on a mobile phone. So what do I do? Good question. I've worked in the area of either providing training, support, tuition to other people using technology, managed services, and sorry, I'll just flick my other ear off because my screen reader's reading out the messages that are popping up, but it was a bit distracting. And that's not my rant either. And so, yes, I worked in the area of technology for a number of years, and now I'm a contractor doing pieces of work for other organizations, looking at what they can do to make things better from an access perspective, whether it's digital or whether it's just from a user perspective. I host a show on Wellington Access Radio called No Labels, and I'm a trustee for Able, the organization who produces captioning and audio description for TV.
Another very busy guy.
And I'm always looking for other things to do. So, today I was talking to a group of students up at Victoria University about accessibility, and I help a number of students with their projects on making sure, is this going to work? Does this meet the brief that they're looking, they're wanting to build something for? To me, wonderful. Something that's universal design that meets as many people's requirements as possible is always the best. And if you get it right at the beginning, then you don't have to try and retrofit it afterwards or become so much of an expense. It just doesn't happen.
Thank you
my
so
rant,
much.
my rant.
What really grinds your alley gears?
There's a whole host of them. There's a whole host of them, but the one I guess that annoys the most out of me at times is I jump online and I want to do something. And all of a sudden I go to a website or I'm using the smartphone and out comes this either video with audio blasting out, which kills my screen reader. Or it's a pop-up that blocks me from actually even getting out of it so I can get to the page that I need to do something. And I have tried all sorts of things. At one time, escape was always a great option. Hit escape and that should kill it. But then someone obviously must have got wise to that, and so they changed how they built their web pages. And so hopefully, there's not too many that go down that path these days, but there's a few news products and a few other apps and websites out there that want to blast you with headlines or whatever it might be, and to try and find out how to shut this someone talking about something or a advertisement or a video clip of some description, how to shut it up so I can actually get on and do what I want to do on the site, can be a real challenge. So my way of addressing it is really to find out who owns the site or who the developer was. Go to the app store if it's on my iPhone, find out who it is, send them a nice little note or give them a low rating and say why I've rated it low. It's nothing worse than looking at some ratings and they just say 1. Well, why is it a 1? So I might say, it's actually the controls weren't labeled properly, or in this case, your video drowned out voiceover or drowned out my screen reader and I wasn't able to access the site. Sometimes I get a response back and people really don't know what a screen reader is and have no idea. And so my best solution really has been when it's been someone local, or I've even jumped online with someone a few weeks ago and I've shown them what the issue is and said, so when I tab around or I try and bring up a list of links or I try and go to a heading, I actually can't hear my screen reader because of all this noise that's basically stopping me from doing what I need to do.
Yeah.
And once people see it, okay. And I must say that there's probably less and less sites that seem to do it that I come across these days, but it's certainly, they're still out there and they're still a pain in the butt.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's great that you try to solve the problem yourself by going directly to the developer. But can any of our panel suggest permanent fixes to this? So that, screen reader users don't have to contact the developer or the site owner?
It's a real turnoff.
It is. It is. I think browser policy has been a godsend, I think, from this, the way that Apple and Google and particularly have responded to this and saying no to autoplay. Although I have seen a product manager try to get past browser policy by trying to say that doing a swipe gesture on a tablet is pressing a play button. You're accepting, and I was like, no. The policy is not there to get past. The policy is there to stop stupidity. So please don't carry on trying to do something that is obviously daft. The reason they're blocking it is. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why this is going away, is because, eventually if you break browser policy, you get removed from Google's index and no one can ever find you again, which is a bad thing. We don't want that to happen. And modals, there's no excuse to making a modal inaccessible. There's so much good documentation out there that just tells you quite simply how to deal with that. And I think sometimes as well, if you're going to run a complaint, it would be good if there was a resource everyone could just point to and say, if you don't know how to do it, here's how to do it. Please do it, and make it easy for them. So don't just present them with the problem. Sometimes when I do complain things, I try and give them as much information as possible. I say, this is the software I'm using. This is exactly what I'm experiencing. What happened? And if you do have any kind of expertise to say, and if you have a look over here, you might find some things that might help you fix that. or, you know, get back in touch and let me know, you know, I'm, you know, and having a dialogue. You can't do it with everyone. I mean, there's so much broken stuff in the world. It's kind of a ridiculous thing to say that the users have to fix the services that should be accessible to them. But I think, you know, it sometimes, you know, having that dialogue does help if you have the time to do it.
It certainly has made a difference with some sites that I've experienced issues with.
I mean, at the BBC, I used to, whenever I was doing public speaking, I used to ask everyone to complain. And he said, if you lot don't complain, I don't know what's broken. The estate is massive, 44 languages, millions of web pages, thousands going up every day. And there's 7 of us, you know, dealing with all of that. So if I don't know what's suddenly broken, and I've got an idea, I'm pretty sure that most things are okay. But if something breaks off in a corner, I don't know. So please have a go, you know, and give us as much information as you have time to give us. You know, we shouldn't over expect, you know, people to spend their life complaining about everything, but, you know, it really did help.
Thank you, Gareth, and thanks, Thomas, for that really useful rant, for sharing it.
No worries.
Okay, so next on the screen is Tamsin. So Tamsin, could you introduce yourself?
Kia ora, everyone. Yes, I'm Tamsin Ewing. I'm a content designer at the Department of Internal Affairs. I'm based in Wellington, but currently in Australia for a couple of months working remotely. And I'm on secondment working with Jason Kiss on the Web Accessibility Guidance Project, which is a project to write guidance to make it easier for practitioners to create accessible web content. So it's not document-driven guidance, which I totally get would be wonderful. What it is just taking all that jargon and all the concepts in accessibility and all the things that people build, even if they don't know they're building them, and you know, really think about that this, you know, this is a glossary or this is a heading, you know, and things like that, and just tell people what it is, and if you mark it up correctly or build it correctly, who it will benefit. Here's some examples, and then send people off to some of the best guidance in the world, not like reinventing the wheel, but that's the idea of it. And hopefully it will be helpful. It's still not, you know, perfect, but it hopefully will help New Zealand practitioners at least to meet the web accessibility standard. Yeah.
Thank you. And maybe after your rant, if you could share that, I know it's only alpha phase for the design system, but maybe you could share it in the chat, because even at this early stage is some really useful help.
Yes, yeah, I might, because one of the topic that I'm going to talk about, my little rant is, it's basically, I mean, I looked at some of the topics that people were going to talk about today. Not everybody shared, but some people did. And, you know, mine is a very nitty-gritty one. It's from a content designer perspective. So I hope that will be all right. If there are any content people in the audience, I hope it will be meaningful to you. But it's a hole that I keep falling into, and it does grind my alley ears. I'm hoping that our panel of experts can help. It touches on readability and screen reader accessibility. So the topic that I want to rant about is text level semantic elements. And I'm going to pop a little link to what these are in the chat, just so people can kind of take a look at that. There's some examples there, but I'll explain as well a little bit. So when I, as a content designer, first discovered these, they were the most exciting thing, because they sort of gave me access to expressing myself programmatically in ways that machines can understand, not just visually, you know, on a website. So some example, you know, like just to try to describe, you know, it's HTML markup that enables rich text to be understood by a machine. So when we use formatting, for example, to give special meaning to text, like a link, you know, we might like underline it. People visually know that's a link, right? But we also mark it up with the A element so that the machines know that it's a link. Then there are some of these elements that cause problems when I have discussions with, say, other content designers or maybe product owners, you know, for websites, because what happens is the browser sometimes its default style is to turn whatever you've marked up in one of these elements, like let's say it's an M element, which is for emphasis, stress emphasis, or maybe it's a strong element just to, make something bold, right? These elements have meanings, it's not just bold or italics, they actually have a meaning behind it. But what happens is, there's also this research that, for example, I think it's, I just wrote it down so I'd actually be able to say, there's the Good Fonts for Dyslexia study in 2013 that measured the impact of font type on people with dyslexia. And so people often say, oh no, you can't use any, it's a blanket ban, you can't use any italics, you can't use any bold. And I say, well, it's not bold and italics we're talking about the meaning behind words, why we would use them. Like sometimes words are very important. We might want to bold them and also mark it up as very important using the strong element, right? And so I thought, well, maybe they're right. And so I went and did a bit of research myself, and I read Gareth Williams, your 2020 article, A Guide to Understanding What Makes Typeface Accessible. I looked at W3C, making content usable for people with cognitive and learning disabilities. And I also looked at, the advice that W3C gives about, they say, oh no, it's actually, that study was for passages of text, long passages of text, 60 words. So that it was all italicized or all in bold. So of course people were finding it difficult, but usually the way we want to do it, when, just some meaningful word, we just want to mark up one word or just a little phrase. And so it shouldn't have that problem. And then I get another argument that says, well, screen readers don't support these. And so, I would say, well, we should design for the future. Maybe they will one day. And then someone else will say, well, people have misused or abused the M and the I and the B and the strong elements so much that, they're all just turned off because they're meaningless. And so it's like, I often get this resistance to what I want to do as a content designer is provide the clearest meaning possible using the code as well as, visual aspects. And so it really grinds my alley gears that, text is being stripped of so much semantic richness because of this 2013 study that said no. But it wasn't, you've actually got to look at the context. Sometimes the context requires this meaning, so that basically is my rant. And the only solutions that I could come up with were, apart from designing for the future, which I feel like even if it's being used wrongly somewhere and screen readers are not supporting it currently, at least they might do one day. I think it's super important to use it judiciously. I mean, you shouldn't use it everywhere, but you really need to think about, does this help the user by providing this extra meaning? And what if they can't see? So maybe it needs to be programmatically exposed to them. And then some of the elements in the list that I've sent, because the browser has this default, make everything look italics, like there's a what would it be, a definition element, I think, or the site element. I think some of them are just rendered into italic text. And so the page author can just change the CSS, and actually, not, if you choose to not have it in italic text, then that would be fine. And Jason Kiss also told me that you can download an italic font that matches your website. You don't have to use what the browser chooses to use. You could actually do that as well. So I'm not a developer, but I just thought there are these solutions, and it's about having the conversation and not just having a blanket ban without considering that perhaps the user would benefit from this. But I'm very interested in anybody who has experience with these kinds of arguments, and I might be completely wrong, and I'm happy to stand corrected. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I can imagine that's quite frustrating in your role. But does any of our panel, can they comment on this use of italics and strong and M, these semantic meaning in code that can affect a screen reader experience, for example?
I'm not going to foray into that, but I am going to say I wonder whether this is maybe a more systemic issue that I often come across, where once again, it's around that understanding maturity around accessibility, where people are looking for that yes, no answer, or do this, not that. They don't want to get into the specifics and the intricacies and the different, user needs and that kind of thing. They're still looking at it at a very surface level, and that's where we get some of these sort of blanket rules and pushbacks and that kind of thing, because that's still how we're seeing, or some people are seeing accessibility. And I think it's an education and a culture shift at a higher level, and this is probably one example of that.
Yes, Sarah.
I think Tamsin has hit on something really, really important that goes way beyond the specific gripe that you have, Tamsin, which is the issue of technology moves on, and the ability of assistive technologies moves on as well. I can remember, and I'm sure that there are several people in this discussion can remember very clearly, the time when HTML emails were an absolute no-no for screen readers. And now, of course, they're totally, well, not totally okay, depending on the on the code, but definitely they are very, very, very useful at times. So I think it's really important to beware of blanket yes/no answers to anything, because what's yes/no today may not well be in 2, 3, 5 years from now. And also, if there are some screen readers, one in particular, that will absolutely interpret a lot of these text effects and allow you as the user to hear those effects spoken in different voices or have different braille output and what have you. So that possibility is there already in some cases, but by no means all. And that of course is the problem. You need a solution that works for as many people as possible. But I think the wider thing that Tamsin is raising is actually really, really important, and that is not to get stuck in a stasis that says from now on this is what accessibility is and it cannot be developed or built upon. So thanks for that.
Yeah,
Thank you, Neil.
Yeah,
thanks, Neil.
I'm not going to be I'm going to be a stuck record here, because it's a rant. This is about designed experiences. It's about it's not just about meeting a minimum requirement and shoving stuff out. It's actually giving someone a good experience when they get there. It's always the one thing in WCAG that's really annoyed me is within the principles, because I think when the principles for WCAG were written, they were thinking about American government websites, because we got perceivable, operable, robust and understandable, but no one ever says enjoyable within that, right. and it things have to be good as well as functional. There's an emotional aspect to this as well, and user experience deals with in design deals with as much as function as it does with emotion, and yet accessibility often slices the emotional out to get the functional. And I find this is one of those things where you're talking about the way that people are experiencing the text, the meaning. That there's nothing worse than listening to a text-to-speech engine, sort of reading Wuthering Heights. It's absolutely appalling. It's a monotone, sort of thing, just drolling on, or you need a human being reading that. And so it's having those kind of contextual outputs and designing the experience around the experience is the thing. And this kind of markup, the choice of font, the use of italics actually are the experience. And it's and those blanket things, Tamsin, that you're saying, I mean, some of the studies I've read on dyslexia and text, they really grind my gears, because they treat everyone as the same, or they'll go and talk to 5 people who are dyslexic and then come back and say, well, 10% of the audience need this because 5 people are, well, that's not statistically significant.
Well, that study was 48 people, and the passages of text were 60 words long. And to be fair to the people that are, it's more of a discussion. It's not it's just people are at where they're at, sort of thing, but they are actually arguing for usability. They're saying it's not readable, and so it's just about trying to find the evidence that actually, well, that's not so much the case. If you do it judiciously, that's I'm not really saying that people they are thinking about the user, they're trying to think about the user, but it's these are the arguments or debates that we're having. It's not about being right or wrong, it's just more about we're trying to work out what's best for the user. But there are two users here, if you like. If you're saying one won't be able to read it, that's a fair point if it were true. And that's why I'm happy the panel is here just to confirm whether that's true. And secondly, will it even be able to be accessed by assistive technologies? What's the point, would be the other argument. But, I think that, as Neil was saying, we do design for the future. We look at that. And English is one of those languages, it's got flexible stress. It's called, I think we have a flexible stress pattern. So the way we express ourselves, it's important which words we stress, and it changes the meaning completely. You've got lots of examples of I know what to do, or I know what to do, or I know what to do, or I know what to do.
Exactly. It's designed experience. This is the whole thing. If you want the thing to work, you have to design it. Closed captions utterly infuriate me in this space, because people just think that as long as you've got text at the bottom, it's fine. And as long as it's verbatim, and oh gosh, I hate it when they're dumbed down. Oh, ding-batted things. No, there's a right to access. Don't edit what's being said. Put it up there as to what it is. Right. But then, then how do I understand whether that was sarcasm? How do I understand whether that was lyrics or spoken words? How do I understand whether that was humor? How it was directed? Where someone was? All of this information needs to also be contained. You need to contain all of that information within there, because it should be, again, a designed experience. There was a lovely one Red V Media did when in the UK the first time they showed Marvel, the first Avengers films, and they did all of Hulk's subtitles in green and all of Captain America's in blue and all of Iron Man's were in red, and they color coordinated it. And there was a lot of people who are autistic and dyslexic, etc., who also use and deaf and culturally deaf, who use captions. I use captions all the time. They help me with comprehension because I've got ADHD and dyslexia. But they added that information in as to who was speaking, and it reduces a certain amount of cognitive load, and it becomes part of the experience of the thing. You're not constantly trying to work out who's saying what and seeing the things going out. It added to that, and I thought it was a brilliant thing that hadn't been briefed in. It was just a captioner who went, well, the palette's there and I'll assign them nicely, and it was a lovely bit of ad hoc design. But it is this thing, it's designed experiences. It's not just about meeting minimum requirements.
Thank you.
That's what this markup can give.
So just to answer your question earlier, Zoe, that link that I put in the chat actually does go to the project site, and there just to address some of the things that people were talking about earlier, we've actually created pages for people who are who've got a product ownership function or a senior management function, just to help clarify how they can support accessibility and just accessibility through these different 7 roles. And of course, looking for feedback. If anybody sees anything that is wrong, please tell me. Really, but I think that could be helpful. I mean, if people are trying to educate and share and influence, sometimes you don't have to have the recording. You can send a person to a page.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Tamsin, and for sharing that very useful rant as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your help.
Okay, and next of our ranters is Sishen. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what really grinds your alley gears?
Good evening. My name is Sishen. I'm a UI experience designer. A bit of my background, I started out in advertising. I was at a11y and TVWA for 6 years. And then I made a conscious decision to switch to UI design and then experience design. So here's my rant. When Zoe contacted me, I was having an issue, if you like. The brand color is not accessible. And I thought about it afterwards. There's actually a bigger problem, which is color palette. Yeah. And what frustrated me most is whenever I brought up, pointed out, well, this color is not accessible. Yeah. The typical answer, two typical answers. One is, oh, they are not the majority, so we don't care. And the other one is, okay, so in order to meet the requirement, we need to spend money updating the design, yeah? So what benefit, financial benefit do I get? So yeah, these two typical answer, yeah, frustrate me quite a bit.
And how did that impact? Obviously, it frustrated you personally, but what do you think the bigger impact of that is?
I think this is my take. The decision makers, when they look at design, they look at it as a way to sell their product, right? From their point of view, they don't necessarily look at how do we cater to customers and users' needs while we try to sell them products. Yeah, so that's two different mindset. And here's a story about Nico. A few years ago, Nico and I, we worked for a financial a bank, a yellow bank. And Nico, at the time I heard about this big word, accessibility, but I didn't know much about it. And one day Nico ran a workshop, which was open to everybody, whoever was interested in this subject. So I attended, and Nico said, now I want you to take out your load up our banking app on your mobile phone. Now I want you to complete this task, make a transfer. I forget whether make a transfer or make a payment. Now I want you to turn on your voiceover. You are not allowed to use your keyboard and use voiceover to complete that task. No one could do it in 30 minutes, no one. And I was like, oh, what is this thing then? And the story is, put yourself in customers' shoes. If your design caters their needs, then chances are it's probably easier to sell them products. Otherwise, it's very easy to lose potential business, by clicking on close, and then they go to another website. So yeah, that's yeah.
That's the impact. Thank you for sharing that, Sishan. And what solutions did you come up with yourself for this problem, if any?
With color palettes, there's not much I can do. Yeah, especially the brand color, don't touch it at all. But with typography, sometimes I can sneak in some solution, because most developers I've worked and working with, they're actually very interested in this subject. And some of them are actually advocates of this subject, yeah. So with their help, I could say easily increase the line height, yeah. And when I show client the design, I tend not to use the big word accessibility. I put it as, oh, it makes it easier to read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good workaround.
Yeah.
But does any of our expert panelists, do they have a solution for this? Changing branding color is to make it more contrast, to make it sufficient contrast is it impossible? Is it something that you have a solution for?
I do, but I've seen this. We have many brands at the BBC, and actually the last job I did was on the master brands and core brands for the BBC, and we knew from years of this exact issue, having a huge suite of brands, hundreds of them, and then everything from program brands to channel brands to digital brands. It's a massive problem. One of the things that we did do once was, because so many marketeers think about color in terms of print, they think about the way that it's controlled, and I come from print design background, and you have far more control of the sort of the reality of how that color manifests. You're dealing with Pantone, we know how it works, and you're matching. But as soon as you go into digital, those colors don't exist. Brand colors don't really exist. And I got around this once with with a bunch of marketeers where I had to point out to them that actually none of the colors that you are talking about, that you are showing me, actually exist to the end users. And we had this wonderful team called the accreditation team, and all they do is they test the implementation of iPlayer on TV platforms, because it's always built in, and the manufacturer implements the application. And so, we didn't have control over that. So it's in the Samsung TV, it's in the set-top box or the DVD player or whatever. And so we had this huge wall of TVs, pre-production TVs, all at factory calibration. And we just created a web page, put the color pink that we were discussing up as a blanket color across all of these screens. And we had 40 different pinks. They were all completely different. And I said, all of those pinks are your pink. So actually the reality from the users, and interestingly enough, I think at the time, Sony had the oldest board of directors. So you have the reddest pink, and Samsung had the youngest board of directors. And so you have the bluest pink within that, because it's usually calibrated to the eye condition versus age of the board of directors of the TV company. I didn't realize that until one of the engineers told me, but it was as a general rule. So I said, look, so you can let go a little bit now of your preciousness around the colors, and we can actually find something that works within the suite of family where we can do with color. We'll extend that. So you're never going to get the pink. I remember the phrase, I'm wedded to this pink. I love that. It will stick in my mind forever. And I was like, well, you're wedded to something. You're wedded to a ghost. Doesn't exist. It's just a number. So we can let go of that. And so eventually what we did is we eventually built all of this into the master brand system and got around that way. But yeah, it's getting them to let go that the color that they think that they are defending doesn't actually exist.
Thank you, Gareth.
That's a great story.
Yes, thank you very much for that.
Sarah or Neil, anything to add to that? Or
just thank you for that, because I can use that. Example.
It was brilliant. You should have seen the looks on their faces when they were looking at all of the 40s. It just does not compute at first. And it was like, right, okay, we're getting this now. But literally, yeah, because you don't know how end user equipment's set up. We all change it. We've got our brightness set up differently. We have different types of screens, all of this, and our, environmental lighting, everything impacts on this, the way it renders out. So we can be flexible and it won't break.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, now on to Mike. So Mike, can you introduce yourself and tell us what really grinds your alley gears?
Hi folks, my name is Mike Lloyd. I'm based here in sunny Tauranga. For the last, forever now, I've been working in the world of adaptive technology, essentially working with people who are blind or low vision or deafblind. And recently also working in a bit of a side hustle to do with more an entrepreneurial aspect, to do with like an online accessibility business to do with access travelers, which is hugely interesting. But my rant, if you like, is obviously over a lot of time I've been working with people to help them work through different websites and various apps and bits and pieces. Primarily myself, I'm totally blind, so I'm using a screen reader myself, and obviously a phone with voice, and operating that with hand gestures and keyboard for computer. So when I'm doing a search of some kind, whether it be on a site for a product or different items, if it's a Google search and all that sort of thing, it's good to be able to do the search. But the next problem I quite often find on a site that doesn't allow it is that wading through the results can be a huge pain in the butt. Whereas a site that's got a few little tips or a few attributes in the right place can be a very user-friendly, quick, efficient process. For example, if I go into Google and I do a quick Google search, I know that the first 10 results are all going to be listed with a heading. So if I'm using a gesture on the phone or a keyboard, I can just hit H or flick down to the next heading. It gives me a summary of that heading, gives me the information I need to get a bit of a general overall concept of what I'm looking for. And if I want to go further, I can activate that link, or I can flick or hit H and go to the next one if I don't want it, or to the previous one. It's pretty efficient. If I'm on Facebook, I can use H and jump down to the next posting. So it's pretty simple. But if I go to another site for a product, and quite often I can get down so I can find the beginning of the results. And after teaching people that there's more to using a screen reader than hitting the down arrow 400 times to get to where you want to, I have to say, oh, you have to hit the down arrow 400 times to move through this part. So it's finding information is really good, but getting through those results can be hugely painful. And for a lot of people, I find it's my sighted peers. Obviously, everyone's been at a dinner table and they pick up their phone and they flick down and they think, oh, here's the answer. And you sort of think, if I tried that, I'd be here 10 minutes later on that site just to find a basic result.
Okay, so I suppose the impact on you is super frustrating and time consuming. But have you come across any solutions or ways around this problem yourself?
Well, it's quite simply. I mean, a lot of times we find sites with a certain result or the findings, if you like, have got various attributes like the headings, or sometimes they start with a checkbox, or there's it might start with a graphic or something that you can grab onto with a keystroke or a gesture. But even just using a standard heading with the right amount of information in that heading gives me everything I need to find out if that's the item I want to look into further. So, like I say, on a Google, I can move to the next heading or the previous heading, and it gives me the information I want to in a clean, concise way to make a decision whether I want to go further on that result or go to the next one. Whereas if it's got several components to it, I'm there forever.
Okay, thanks very much for sharing that rant, Mike. Very useful for us all to know. Do any of our panelists have any solutions that they would recommend for being able to navigate search results more efficiently as a screen reader user?
The issue is, Zoe, I think that so many different sites and so many different systems upon which those sites are built render those search results in so many different ways. That is the issue that Mike is describing. And you will know, because you and I have done presentations together, that whenever I do a presentation to a company about their website with us and showing them what using it with a screen reader is like, one of the standard tests I do is, what is the search engine like and what is the search results specifically like, precisely for the reasons that that Mike says. So it's I think the solution is to educate our friends in the who are building these sites that headings are so valuable and so useful. There are other semantic techniques that you can use, but you won't know until you see the results page which one is going to work best for you in that particular instance.
That's a great advice. Thanks, Neil. Conscious of the time, and so this is actually open rant time. So if anybody does have a rant from our attendees, please post into the Q&A. We do actually, we have Laura and Catherine who are monitoring our Q&A. Do we have any, Catherine, do we have any rants from our audience?
Yes, we do. Eric from Access Lab in Stockholm says, what really grinds my alley gears is when product owners go for legal compliance, and while they might do something better for screen reader users, they make a shitty cognitive experience, and they know it, but they need to tick off the legal boxes.
Okay, so does any of our panelists have any questions, answers to Eric's rant there?
I had a go at it, actually. I responded to Eric. Busy sort of slightly typing away at the back of it. And I think there's a couple of things there. Again, it's going back to design experience over, it's legal experience design versus user experience design. And, you know, and sometimes you shouldn't be going down that route. If the designers are doing their job and designing designed experiences for everyone, you shouldn't end up in that situation where you're having those conversations in the first place. And I think there's a UX issue within the organization that, you know, this is it. They're pushing accessibility out of UX into a something else to deal with, and it becomes legal. That's a massive problem in its own right. And that sort of is as a process issue. But I think there's also that whole thing is we're always dealing with trade-offs in accessibility. We're always dealing with tough decisions. Even if we get to that point and we come down to it and we go, well, actually, what we're going to do to benefit one group could be at the detriment for another. And so there's different ways you can deal with this. I mean, sometimes you could, if it's a tough decision, you have to turn around and say, right, who's actually going to experience a barrier and who's it going to be a bit inconvenient for? Is there a scale here? You know, and you have to deal with it. And sometimes you go, well, for one group of people, this is going to reduce their experience. For someone else, it removes the experience, and so that wins. But then there's also choice, and you can find within the design is creating other choices, other ways of doing stuff within the core design itself will enable people to find different paths of being able to, you know, sort of get around the issue. And so again, that piles this back into it's a UX problem. And you shouldn't, if your UXers are doing their job correctly, you shouldn't be having this discussion in the first place.
Thanks, Gareth. I think it's similar to Alexa's grant, actually.
Yeah, very.
Thank you very much for raising that, Eric. So while we're waiting,
I was just firstly going to add that sometimes what is happening here is that, and it can be for various reasons why the focus on legal happens, but I call it designing from a place of fear. And we rightly need the mechanisms, and it's not so prevalent in Australia and New Zealand, but certainly overseas and in the US and that kind of thing, we have a lot of those legal cases going on. And for all the legitimate ones, we absolutely need those avenues, but generally what the outcome is that those organizations and others that are looking at that, their primary motivator is fear. And I've spoken to even a large company in the US that I was chatting to, and they were progressive in accessibility, but coming from an Australian background, we got started talking and I actually pointed out that they actually were still making some of their accessibility decisions, their design decisions based on fear rather than necessarily what's the best and inclusive experience. And it's hard because we feel like we're stuck within a rock and a hard place at the moment sometimes with that balance of needing these legal mechanisms in place, but that leading to a suboptimal outcome, which is just what is my minimum? How do I cover my ass, essentially?
Yeah.
And we know.
If I may, I remembered. Oh, sorry, Neil.
No, you go. You go.
I remember having similar battles with the legal departments in a couple of situations. I think if I can add my 2 cents to that one, the one effective way that I found in the past is understanding the reason behind the suggested solution and challenge how the suggested solution is addressing the reason. For example, as a company, you must demonstrate that your user, all of your users, understand X, Y, or Z regarding to your policies. Legal department, in order to cover their backs, elaborate a very complex paragraph in order to cover every single element of the things that they want to communicate. Mm-hmm. So you can always go and test, and you can demonstrate to the legal department that your users are not understanding, therefore you are not meeting with your legal obligation.
Thanks, Nico.
Yeah.
Neil, did you want to?
Only to follow up on the points that Sarah made as well, that we know that one of the main selling points for the dreaded overlays that we come across from quite frequently. Yes, I know. I was trying to hold it in and I've just failed.
We got there eventually.
We did,
I was wondering when these would come up.
Well, we got to past 80 minutes. I think we did very well. But one of the main selling points is, or has been and still is, they will help you avoid legal action. And of course, a lot of them are finding out the hard way that even that's not the case. So it does come from a position of fear. We don't want to get sued, so we'll take whatever steps someone comes to us and says we'll take that fear away from us. And even then, it's not working for them. I could rant forever about overlays. I'm not going to do it, Zoe, I promise.
But there's so much. I think there's such a good point in there, because there's unscrupulous marketing that's going on left, right, and centre, and it's not just by, you know, sort of. I mean, I can't think of a better way of describing them, but ambulance chasing legal firms in America. So I've got a client at the minute, just had 2 shots across their bow. Because someone has run a letter, I don't know, Lighthouse on a couple of pages and decided that they can find someone plaintiff to put this up. They want a payout. They don't want to go to court. And you think they're going, right, okay, so we need to understand what our evidence is around dealing with these. So, you know, moment war chest, pay them off. They want paying off. They don't want to go any further. They send out 500, you know, sort of demands a month, and they expect 100 back, and they get 50, you know, the legal firm makes $10,000 per challenge, and it's just churn, and they're not interested in change. And so we've created a monster. But the problem is we also market our services too heavily on compliance first, experience second. And so we're actually feeding the monster. And there's this horrible vicious circle that's going on within our own industry, is that by focusing on legal compliance, we're creating a compliance monster that we're then going to feed. And the actual users are the ones that get forgotten about, because it all goes down into legal experience design. So I think the way that we're going to break this cycle is by changing the way that we prove whether things are good, or the way that we understand what good is, and getting away from WCAG being good to getting to having really good UX data based on real user experience at scale that tells us whether people are actually having a good user experience or not. People are able to do the things that they want. Was it comparative to other users? And did they enjoy it? You know, did they have a good, you know, customer experience? This is kind of my thing at the minute, and it has been for a while. We don't have that. And we need, as an industry, to find out how do we bridge the data gaps, because that is the thing that will counteract people making false claims or using compliance as a way of extracting money from companies.
Thank you for those really, really useful solutions. So we did have one more rant from our audience. I think, Laura, do you have that it was sent by email?
I've got it, Zoe.
Oh, Catherine. Yep, Catherine.
This is from Crystal, who says, something that really grinds my alley gears is the uncentering of disability in accessibility conversations, and what I believe is the hyper-focus on technology. I'm glad that people are learning about how to accessibly design, code, test, etc. But it means stuff all if disabled people aren't there to use it. I give a talk about the socioeconomic effects of disability and what that means for accessibility. I don't give this talk because those effects are somehow minor factors. They are cornerstones. I am constantly surprised how many people, many that have years of accessibility experience, don't know the many barriers and problems that disabled people face to survive economically. A survival that is key to gaining access to and using the very digital applications we work on. Accessibility is a human right, and we need to centre the humans that need accessibility. That means that energy is found to demand people use alt text on Twitter, asking companies to not use overlays, we would have got there eventually, or pointing out some new web developer for using divs needs to be brought to demand accessible and affordable housing, eliminating sub-minimal wages and calling attention to economic and social issues that have a vast impact on people with disabilities. The question I ask of the panel is, how can we go about recentering actual humans in accessibility?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Catherine, on behalf of Crystal. So our expert panel, how do we respond to that? Any
socioeconomic accessibility. Come on, there's so much to go for on this, because this is and you know, we can look at this domestically within our own countries and how that impacts. And I think there's so eloquently put already within the question is there's a huge thing. But if we're dealing with international brands, it's amazing how we then even tier that within, you know. So when I was, again, BBC, dealing with world service, dealing with, you know, sort of very, very difficult to reach regions, which is the only ones where, you know, 44 languages internationally. We had a service in Pidgin. By the way, there is no text-to-speech engine that delivers Pidgin. I think there was about 10 or more languages that are not supported by any text-to-speech engine at all. Now, that is a level of socioeconomic accessibility that gets forgotten about on an international market, that even the assistive technologies ignore swathes of people because they're not seen as profitable enough to be able to support. And so, you know, we look at our screen reader surveys, and that's great. It tells you everything you want to know about North America. It does not tell us about the international use of screen readers. You know, Apple appliances are just not in the South Sudan. So, you know, it's so, you know, this kind of stuff, this perspectives, they get narrowed down on a socioeconomic basis because they're easier to deal with, and or easier data to get hold of. A BBC example that happened a couple of years ago is we have a connected red button service and a red button service. So on a TV, there's a red button on your remote control, and it brings up a text service that's been around based on CFAX originally, which was teletext back in the 70s, and still there. And there's still a text-based service which is delivered over the airways, and it's not delivered via IP. They tried to shut it down. 5% of the UK cannot afford broadband. So if you remove that, there is no other on-demand digital service available to them. And all that kind of information that they're paying for through their license fee is removed away from them, because we're expecting everyone to go online. And we forget that broadband is the same as someone eating for a week. And this is all forgotten about. And people with disabilities have even more costs chucked on top of them. And they're, you know, and all of this gets forgotten about because we go for the easiest to reach. Is that let's design for the people that have the best access within the people that need access group, the ones that are in work, that have the most expensive assistive technologies. And we have to deal with we have to think about everyone right the way through.
Thank you, Gareth. Any final comments from our expert panelists before we wrap up? Okay. All right. Well, that's a wrap. It's 8:30 or just past. We've gone a little bit over. We had so many more rants that we could have shared. Very useful rants, but maybe that's for the subsequent series. But I want to thank you all very much. I want to thank our panelists and our ranters and you attendees for coming along. And we hope that you found something positive and helpful to take away from it and feel a bit lighter because you've had a good rant. Hey, Kona Mai, thank you and happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day, everyone. Goodbye from all of us. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
See you, folks.
Bye.